Good afternoon. It's Friday, the 11th of March, 2022, a bit after 1 o'clock. Apologies for the delay starting. Welcome to UK Column News. I'm your host today, Mike Robinson. Joining me in the studio, as usual, Patrick Henningsen from 21st Century Wire.
Great to be with you, Mike.
And also joining us, I'm delighted to say, is Vanessa Beeley. Welcome to the programme, Vanessa. Yeah, good stuff. Right, look, we're going to get straight on, Patrick, with a video clip reminder from Liz Truss.
We are, but let's just set this up. What are we talking about here? There's very shocking reports that we've seen recently in the last few days. And obviously we have our guest, Vanessa Beeley, is going to give us some analysis on this. But there are reports that jihadists, Islamist extremists, terrorist fighters from Syria are now making their way to Ukraine to join the fight on behalf of the Zelensky government and Ukraine, and also on behalf, really ostensibly, of NATO. And the British Foreign Secretary Liz Truss, it wasn't so long ago, Mike, that she made a public announcement, almost like a call to arms for people anywhere to head to Syria, and that they'll have the backing of the British government, if I'm not mistaken.
Well, let's listen to that.
The people of Ukraine are fighting for freedom and democracy, not just for Ukraine, but for the whole of Europe, because that is what President Putin is challenging. And absolutely, if people want to support that struggle, I would support them in doing that. So you support? Absolutely, if that's what they want to do.
So now she has apparently yesterday backtracked from that somewhat, but nonetheless, there were headlines over the last week or so, Patrick, you know, with concerns that 4 British military personnel had absconded from Poland and were heading to Ukraine, and there were the headlines were saying things like that, you know, Putin might assume that Britain has entered the war, sort of thing. So, but the message was already given, and of course, as we've mentioned on this program, Patrick, all the images of the young, attractive Ukrainian women holding the guns, of course, is going to attract mercenaries and so on as well.
Well, that's part of the marketing, and we saw similar things with Syria, which Vanessa will also probably remind us of some of those things. But let's just point to this article here. This is on Off Guardian. The headline is "NATO's White Helmets Follow Al-Qaeda to Ukraine," and this is not an exaggeration. This is actually happening, and we warned at the time when Truss made those comments that that was a dog whistle to anyone and everyone, that basically they have the backing of NATO, the leading NATO member state, the UK, along with the US, to pick up arms or go there and pick up arms when you arrive, because our governments are actually trafficking weapons into that war zone, and openly so, and proudly so. European governments, United States, and Britain as well. So I think we can probably bring Vanessa Beeley on the line right now. And Vanessa, tell us about this latest development, and you've written about this in detail here. I know the original report came from Al Mayadeen, Middle Eastern news outlet, but just give us your feelings and what you think is happening here.
Well, I mean, it was inevitable. Even prior to the Al Mayadeen article, we'd seen evidence that terrorist groups, particularly from Idlib, that had already been percolated to Libya and Azerbaijan by Turkey, were being effectively tunneled out of Idlib through Turkey, another NATO member state, into the Ukraine to fight alongside the Nazi and ultra-nationalist factions in Ukraine, backed, of course, by the NATO member states that are backing terrorism inside Syria. And then, rather interestingly, there was an opinion piece by Josh Rogan in Washington Post, not always guaranteed to be a credible news outlet, but talking about the fact that Raed Saleh, who's now nominated himself the chairman of the White Helmets, Raed Saleh, of course, as I've explained in the article and with a link to 21st Century Wire reports, has terrorist ties himself, as do the majority of the White Helmet leadership, is talking, of course, let's say, digging up the old accusations that were levied by UN agencies, Western media, and of course their mouthpiece, the White Helmets, at the Russian military in Syria, of bombing hospitals, bombing schools, bombing civilian infrastructure, etc., etc., without providing any of the context, of course, that the majority of those schools and hospitals, as I witnessed myself throughout Syria, were occupied by the terrorist armed groups. And of course, we'll discuss that when we later on discuss some of the propaganda that's coming out of Ukraine. So effectively, anyway, basically, this is an excuse for the White Helmets to kind of resurrect the propaganda that kept them going inside Syria, corroborating UK-US foreign policy, providing the chemical weapons staged defense, as in the case of Duma 2018, to sustain the demonization and criminalization of the Syrian government and its allies inside Syria battling NATO member state-backed terrorism. And eventually, right, Salah talks about, well, you know, not only will we provide help from afar, we're prepared to send teams into Ukraine. So as I pointed out in a 2018 interview that I did with the Corbett Report, I alluded to the fact that there was a very high potential of the White Helmets becoming a global franchise. They then did pop up in various areas in the Philippines, in Malaysia. More recently, Alistair Harris, who's the CEO of the ARC Group, Analysis, Research and Knowledge, for whom James Lemessurier, the British military intelligence founder of the White Helmets, was working in 2013 when he established the White Helmets and the Free Syrian Police, is now establishing a White Helmet brigade in the Palestinian areas of Tripoli. And of course, Alistair Harris has been involved in British MI6 intelligence infiltration of Lebanese military and security and political institutions. So, you know, the point is that this idea of the White Helmets becoming a global franchise is now coming true as predicted, and we're seeing them popping up just about everywhere. So I guess the doubling down by Josh Rogan, he's doing his job, he's protecting the brand, he's sweeping all the criticism and the accusations, very credible accusations levered against the White Helmets under the carpet in order for them to pop up as the humanitarian outreach agency in Ukraine.
Yes,
Sorry,
and
that was long.
I think it's also worth noting that, you know, what is the point of having these types of auxiliaries on the scene, as we'll show you with the hospital footage in Mariupol in a minute, Mike. It's to generate the images,
Yes.
which then get transmitted to the global media, and certainly just briefly, Vanessa, because we're going to move a little bit on this, but that's really the whole point. Really, that's the main purpose, isn't it, of the White Helmets? It's the media images that they produce, and then how that affects the public opinion about the conflict.
And don't forget that the White Helmets were the primary promoters of the no-fly zone in Syria. So you're going to start to see the ratcheting up of propaganda to elicit the no-fly zone from NATO member states.
Yeah.
That's a good point.
Very good
because
point.
everyone's screaming right now. Zelensky himself is shouting, demanding a no-fly zone from show us that you're real Europeans, show us that you care about the people of Ukraine, institute a no-fly zone. But what is he really doing, Mike, but attempting to drag the world into a war,
Right.
a world war potentially as well. But
Okay, well, let's move on then. Let's move to this first. Here's the UK government's latest update on Ukraine this morning. It was probably posted yesterday, but sanctions imposed on Roman Abramovich, that was in the news yesterday, of course, and a number of others there, including Dmitry Lebedev at the bottom. Now, it was a bit embarrassing for the Foreign Office because they decided to push this tweet out yesterday, sanctioned Dmitry Lebedev, but Patrick, that doesn't look like Dmitry Lebedev in the image. In fact, that's Dmitry Medvedev, the former president and prime minister of Russia, right?
yeah, that's the wrong guy.
That's the wrong guy, right? But it gets even better because here is Huffington Post. Foreign Office deletes embarrassing PR blunder after oligarch mix-up on Twitter. But unfortunately, the Huffington Post couldn't do much better either, because at the end of this, they say that Dmitry Lebedev's family have been in the news recently because his son, Evgeny Lebedev, was appointed to the House of Lords in 2020, despite security concerns allegedly raised by spy organizations at the time. The Prime Minister has denied that he ignored security concerns when he decided to hand Lebedev a peerage, except that Evgeny Lebedev is not the son of Dmitry Lebedev. He is the son of Alexander Lebedev, and so they got it wrong as well. So they're busy taking the mickey out of the Foreign Office, and the Foreign Office deserved to have the mickey taken out of them, but they made just as big a blunder.
Who's the author there, Mike? Kate Nicholson.
Yes.
Following in the footsteps of Chris York, it seems.
Well, indeed, yes. Which takes us on to the Mail, Russia's latest false flag.
Well, this is the big story right now, and again, we'll give you a brief synopsis of this right now. But this is what the UK press, this is what the Western press is saying. They're calling it Russia's latest false flag. Moscow accuses the U.S. of helping Ukraine with illegal bioweapons research on the Black Death, anthrax, rabbit fever, and frenzy of allegations to galvanize public support for Putin's war and justify the invasion. So there's a total, absolute scramble right now, Mike, on all fronts, especially on the U.S. front, because somebody within the U.S. State Department made a major faux pas, along with the U.S. Senator that was asking her the question. We're talking about the Assistant Secretary of State, Undersecretary Victoria Nuland, who herself is the architect of the violent coup in Kiev in February of 2014. That's a historical fact, by the way. That's not debatable. She's back in government now, and she was in front of a Senate committee just a few days ago, Mike, and it seems like Marco Rubio was wanting to put these rumors to rest that the Russians had been seeding out in the global media with their alleged disinformation programs. Let's watch this incredibly telling exchange here from the U.S. Senate.
Ukraine has biological research facilities, which, in fact, we are now quite concerned Russian forces may be seeking to gain control of. So we are working with the Ukrainians on how they can prevent any of those research materials from falling into the hands of Russian forces should they approach.
Well, that sounds like an admission.
Well, what she's effectively doing there, she's confirming everything that the Russians and the Chinese have been trying to raise into the conversation diplomatically as well in the last couple of weeks. So what she's inferring there, Mike, is that the research materials at these biolabs that supposedly didn't exist a couple of days ago, they're either dangerous or they're illegal. And when I say illegal, it means that it would be in violation of the Convention for the stockpiling of dangerous bacteriological materials and retaining them as well. That's also in the United States, Britain, and the Soviet Union. That was effective in 1975. Okay. Now, what we didn't show there, which was Marco Rubio, the senator from Florida, he basically said, and if there's, this is what he said, and I'll more or less quote him, if there's a biological or a chemical attack in Ukraine, are you 100% sure that it's Russia that's going to do it?
Right.
And of course, Nuland said, I am absolutely sure that if there's an attack, chemical or biological, that Russia will be responsible for it. So it seems like they were setting up some kind of a narrative there, or that didn't go as planned. Maybe she wasn't supposed to say that. I don't know.
Well, it certainly seemed like he asked the initial question, she gave that answer, and then he very quickly moved on to the version of blaming it on Russia. Now, perhaps it is that they're setting up a narrative for something which is planned for the not too distant future. There certainly seems to be hints of that narrative building in the mainstream press. And
politicians are dropping that as well in the U.S., and we'll show you Boris Johnson's actually directly said this. He's predicting
Right.
This is going to happen. So what are they talking about? Well, we'll go to this story here, and this is the details that you need. This is now over a month old here, a month and a half old. This is armswatch.com. This is Diliana Gaetanyeva. She was on this show before. Her work is very well known to our viewers at the UK column. Documents expose the U.S. biological experiments on Allied soldiers in Ukraine and Georgia. And so she's talking about the U.S. Department of Defense's Defense Threat Reduction Agency, okay? And they funded 11 of these labs in Ukraine. This is under the banner of the Pentagon, and this is very similar to the Lugar Center, which is in Tbilisi, Georgia. And the biggest one, actually most expensive facility the Pentagon has for this type of, quote, research is in Kazakhstan. And that's the Kazakhstan Science Center for Quarantine and Zoonotic Disease. And that's a BSL-3 lab in Kazakhstan, $110 million facility. But in Ukraine, there's quite a few of these. There's an additional 2 that were due to be constructed, but were halted, delayed because of the war. One in Odessa and another in Kiev. Okay, so that's 13 in total confirmed. Now, Russia's saying there's 24 of these facilities, but Diliana can definitely confirm, just in terms of U.S. funding, these ones. And what's interesting is a lot of these documents were on the U.S. Embassy's website, Ukrainian Embassy for the United States. It was on their website, and they were removed before January 25th or 26th. They're gone. Anyway, luckily, they've been tracked. You can see the links at Arms Watch and also at Diliana's blog as well. But $80 million in U.S. public funds have been allocated for the construction of these facilities. That's just what we know from the Federal Registry for contracts. And I think Black & Veatch is the name of the federal contractor that carried out the construction and the management of these. There's other contractors below that.
Right.
But that's the big contractor, the Halliburton, as it were, of this particular massive project.
Okay.
So this isn't a conspiracy theory. This is actually happening, but yet this is what we see in terms of the gaslighting. Endless amount of articles like this here. This is a Council on Foreign Relations mouthpiece, Foreign Policy magazine, how U.S. bioweapons in Ukraine became Russia's new big lie. And you can see there's tons and tons of these types of denials and fact checks and so forth. There's an endless amount of them. So we're told that this didn't happen. This wasn't happening. And the fact checkers, there's tons of these fact checks out, beating down anybody and calling it Russian disinformation. Here's Glenn Greenwald putting this perfectly with Tucker Carlson on his program, I believe yesterday. But we have that exchange here. And I think Glenn Greenwald explains this as well as anybody. You can see this is our new so-called journalism now in 2022. Go ahead and roll this.
The other point is, any journalist who comes on the air and says that they can state that these concerns are false or a byproduct of disinformation, like journalists have been doing for weeks under the guise of fact-checking, is not telling the truth. All they know is that the Pentagon denies it, the CIA tells them it's not true, and then they equate that, they conflate that with proven fact, which is the #1 problem in journalism that we're seeing very pervasively in this war.
It's so shameful that anybody employed as a reporter would do something like that without doing any actual reporting whatsoever, even bothering to learn about the subject, and then to scold anyone for asking legitimate questions. So here's the problem that I have with it. Government does things that are secret. We don't always know what they are. Maybe some cases that's legitimate. But to attack anyone American citizens who ask honest questions as tools of Russia seems to me so far out of bounds. I'm worried this is being established as a precedent.
Well, as we know, this has been going on for 5 or 6 years, that anybody who questions the predominant mainstream narrative from the media, from the Democratic Party, are tools of Vladimir Putin, are Kremlin agents, are sympathizers for Moscow. This has been their tactic forever, and obviously it's escalated now. But
So this is the problem with the fact checkers. Here we are, we're in a war situation. It has World War III potential ramifications, and you have a very real story that could really incite, it could inflame the conflict. The biological research facilities clearly dealing with deadly pathogens. Now, whether these are research facilities or they're bioweapons developments, that's a very gray area, which we'll show you legally in a minute.
Right.
But Diliana's reports here from some of these documents, that many of them were visible before January 26th, but she reports here the Pentagon has conducted biological experiments with potentially lethal outcomes on 4,400 soldiers in Ukraine and 1,000 soldiers in Georgia, the Republic of Georgia, former Soviet Republic. So according to leaked documents, all volunteer deaths should be reported within 24 hours in Ukraine, 48 hours in Georgia. And both countries are considered most loyal U.S. partners in the region, with a number of Pentagon programs being implemented in their territory. One of them is a $2.5 billion, that's billion, 2.5 billion Defense Threat Reduction Agency biological engagement program, which includes research on bioagents, deadly viruses, antibiotic-resistant bacteria, and studied on the local population. I just have to direct you to her work, and you can go, and she's got all the links to all the relevant documents
And
there.
that will be linked under the video on the UK Column website after the program.
For the show notes here, but just the U.S. government's response to this is just absolutely incredible. Here's Ned Price. This is the State Department spokesperson, fresh out of his 9-year stint with the CIA. Russia's inventing false pretexts in an attempt to justify their own horrific actions in Ukraine. And he goes on, Washington is in full compliance with its obligations under the Chemical Weapons Convention and Biological Weapons Convention, and it does not develop or possess such weapons anywhere. And the plot thickens, Mike. Look at this. Exclusive from Reuters here. I believe this is fresh off the press. The WHO says it advised Ukraine to destroy pathogens in health labs to prevent disease spread. So the WHO and Tedros is now involved in this. Who funds the WHO, by the way?
Oh, US, UK.
And the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation is the third biggest funder. China also funds. There's other people that chip in. But so what is the WHO? What's their involvement in this? And so here is the problem. This is the problem here. This is a great piece by Gary Samore. Who is he? He was in charge of negotiating America's position with the Obama administration regarding safety on chemical and biological weapons. Nobody is checking for violations on biological weapons conventions. So remember what Ned Price just said, the CIA stroke State Department spokesperson, and this is what the actual people negotiating the position said. These types of facilities that research and produce biological agents like vaccines, antibiotics, vitamins, biological pesticides, food, can also produce biological weapons. These are dual-use labs. This is the expert here from the US government. Some pathogens and legitimate medical and industrial uses can also be used for bioweapons. That's a fact. That's a reality. And he goes on. Here's the political opposition to biological weapons verification. The Pentagon expressed fears that inspections of biodefense installations would compromise national security or lead to false accusations of treaty violations. Do you see what we're looking at here, Mike? This is getting interesting, isn't it? So nobody's checking. That's the problem. And now, how does Big Pharma fit into this? Well, this is how they fit in. The Department of Commerce in America opposes any intrusive international inspections on behalf of the pharmaceutical and biotech industries. Such inspections might compromise trade secrets, officials contended, or interfere with medical research or industrial production. Well, guess what? Who's involved with these offshore labs in the former Soviet states, Mike?
Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation?
Well, Big Pharma is involved. Gilead Pharmaceuticals is involved in a big way. And as Diliana reported, at the Lugar Center in Tbilisi, all the contractors, the U.S. ones, have diplomatic immunity and diplomatic license plates. There's a level of classification here. So based on what I've just showed you there, and based on what we know from official documents, this is a black box. You can't know what's going on. You don't know what's inside. It's paid for by the U.S. public money. It's paid for by the U.S. taxpayer. Does anybody see a problem here? We don't see any explanations. We only see denials, but yet we have all this evidence.
Right, and we're going to show a little bit more evidence just after this video clip, but introduce this.
So this is the Speaker of the House. Ladies and gentlemen, this is the third most powerful politician. This is third in command. If the president and the vice president, should something tragic befall them, we hope that that doesn't happen, really. But this is the person that's going to take over, and she has got a lot to say about these bioweapons. Listen to this.
Well, I had last week and this week conversations with the Speaker of the Parliament of Ukraine, and and correspondence that he's sent us and the rest, that has always been one of the things they ask for. But they know that we can't go there. Putin is trying to bait the trap so that we go in, and that's the beginning, could be the beginning of World War III. Putin totally irresponsible, using weapons that are not allowed under the Geneva Convention. Putin, who threatens use of chemical weapons, nuclear, and the rest. So they know that we can't, but it's the ask. Now, he was this morning more. If we can't have a no-fly zone, let us have our own, and we need the airplanes to come in. And that is what that is that there are planes that the Ukraine pilots are trained on, and these are some of the planes that are in Poland. Poland said that they would do it if America said yes. America said yes, and now they want backfill. That's, in other words, if we give these to Ukraine, then we want to. But this morning he was less on the ask for the policy, more on let us do it.
Third in command of the United States of America.
What has happened to your country?
Between Biden and Pelosi, I don't really know what to say. And Kamala Harris was just in Poland. I don't know if you caught any of that. It was hugely uninspirational.
Yes.
She was cackling. I'm scared. A lot of people should be,
yes.
Rightly so.
Well, look, just before we ask Vanessa for a little bit of comment here, I just want to put this on screen because this is from the United States of America. It's an agreement between the US and Ukraine, a treaty, as it were. It was signed in 2005. And you were talking about, Patrick, the World Health Organization expressing concerns to Ukraine about the protection of these biological agents within these labs. But this is 2005, Patrick, and this is what this says. In order to assist Ukraine in preventing the proliferation of technology, pathogens, and expertise that are located at the Scientific Research Institute of Epidemiology and Hygiene, the Ukrainian Scientific Research Anti-Plague Institute, the Central Sanitary Epidemiological Station, and other facilities in Ukraine identified by the Ministry of Health of Ukraine, and that could be used for the development of biological weapons. The US Department of Defense shall provide assistance to the Ministry of Health in Ukraine at no cost. Okay, it goes on to say the Ministry of Health of Ukraine shall use all material, including equipment, instruments, and other supplies, training of personnel and services provided in accordance with this agreement, exclusively for the purpose of preventing the proliferation of technology, pathogens, expertise that are located at facilities in Ukraine that could be used for the development of biological weapons. So that is a treaty signed in 2005 between the US and the Ukraine, which acknowledges the existence of these institutions, that they have material on site which could be used for the development of biological weapons. And there's an acknowledgement there that that material has to be protected in the event of what? I mean, so is there any excuse therefore for any suggestion from the US government or the media or the British government that the Russians will have obtained this material when it was already understood and in treaties that that material would be protected in the event of some situation arising?
Well, especially for what, the last 2 months, they've been screaming that the Russians are going to invade tomorrow, and they kept saying this over and over. You thought at some point there, wouldn't you go in to shut these labs down and commandeer the contents of them and, keep them safe? Why is this an issue all of a sudden right now? So now the Chinese and the Russians are all over this. They're not going to let go, and they're really going to press hard. I think the U.S. has really been caught out here, and they're not being forthcoming with their explanations. And I'm going to sort of chastise the mainstream media because do you guys not see a story here? Do you not see a potential risk? If anything, if you're trying to make a case that Russia is the morally evil party in this conflict, certainly you've just handed Russia a massive gift in this story.
So Vanessa, I've got a little bit that I want to ask you questions on in a second, but what are your thoughts on that, first of all?
Well, I mean, you're quite right. Not only is Boris Johnson and various other officials making announcements of the potential of a chemical attack, of course, by the Russians, But the chatter among Ukrainian commentators on Twitter before I was suspended are also positing the idea of a chemical attack, particularly in Mariupol, which of course is the scene of the alleged hospital attack that we're going to discuss. So yeah, I think there is a very high risk of the White Helmets equivalent turning up in Ukraine, and of course, what's that going to elicit? The potential of no-fly zones, the potential of further involvement. I don't know whether NATO member states are going to commit troops to this war yet. So I'm not quite sure how they're going to respond to it, but of course that will up the propaganda against Russia. But there's one major point that I think the West is very good at underestimating the power of its enemy, and it's doing that right now with Russia. It believes that because it's wiped RT and Sputnik and the Russian media outlets from the board, it has total control of the narrative, but it doesn't. The Russian Foreign Ministry, the Ministry of Defense, are absolutely on the ball with backing up their counterclaims with evidence. And, the West is not dealing with an underfunded media in Syria or Iraq or Libya or Venezuela or Yemen or Palestine. It's dealing with a country that has had decades of preparing itself for this level of propaganda, and it's pushing back hard.
Yes. Okay. Well, let's just look at some of the propaganda coming out of the British government at the moment. So this is their latest update from Ukraine this morning. Update on Ukraine. Russian-backed Assad regime in Syria has used chemical weapons on 8 occasions, according to UN/OPCW investigations. Russia has amplified the Assad regime's unsuccessful attempts to cover up its chemical weapons use, including by making allegations of planned Western-backed chemical attacks that never happened. But of course, Vanessa, there are lots and lots of questions to be asked about the OPCW, and I recommend people have a look at this article, How the OPCW Censored Science, How the OPCW Syria Probe Censored Science by Aaron Mate from the Grey Zone. But just before I get you to comment on this, yesterday in the UN Security Council, James Kariuki, the UK ambassador to the UN, said this: the parallels with Russian action in Syria are clear. Regrettably, the comparison also extends to chemical weapons, as we see the familiar spectre of Russian chemical weapons disinformation raising its head in Ukraine. He went on to say Russia has a long history of deflection, denial, and obstructive behavior when it comes to chemical weapons. In 2017, Putin claimed that Khan Shaykhun attack, for which the expert and impartial OPCW UN Joint Investigative Mechanism found the Assad regime responsible, was staged by the West. So that's what the British government has been pushing out in the last 24 hours. I'm very interested in what you would say to that.
Well, what can I say? I mean, it's just an endless stream of hypocrisy from the West. The OPCW scandal has never been given a fair, or the inspectors have never been given a fair hearing. Why? Because they want to effectively suppress the information that is going to reveal the West, in particular the UK, the US, and France, as war criminals. Don't forget that they bombed Damascus almost immediately after the alleged chemical attack, before the OPCW inspectors had even been able to enter the area. So, right now, I mean, I think what we're seeing is the West desperately trying to defend its own appalling record of genocidal military adventurism globally, and trying to hold Russia as the scapegoat. I mean, as you've just pointed out, it's just been, or rather, it's just been exposed, but of course, Diliana had exposed it previously. A number of other articles had exposed Obama's involvement in the setting up of the biolabs. I believe, actually, George Soros money through a kind of outreach agency is also behind the establishment of a number of those biolabs. And so, we're seeing this deflection this projection onto Russia of the crimes of the West. And most thinking people are going to start seeing through it if they haven't already.
Yes. Okay, well, let's come on to the next graphic that the government pushed out this morning. A Novichok nerve agent was deployed by Russian military intelligence on the streets of Salisbury on March 2018. Novichok, a banned chemical weapon, was developed in the Soviet Union. Russia continued the program. Russia made up to 40 different accounts of the event, seeking to distract and point the blame elsewhere. Well, just in time, of course, if you remember, this is the lady in Amesbury who was
Dawn Sturgis.
Dawn Sturgis, thank you, who was allegedly Novichok poisoned following the Skripal event. And if the BBC here reported that the substance that killed a woman in Amesbury, Dawn Sturgis, was the same Novichok nerve agent that poisoned Sergei and Yulia Skripal, experts have confirmed. Except they didn't quite confirm that because they didn't mention the word Novichok in their report. So first of all, again, it was the OPCW that pushed, that did this investigation. I'm not going to read the details of this. If you want to freeze the screen later on, you can do that. But basically, this was the report into the death of Dawn Sturgis. The team was briefed on the identity of the toxic chemical identified by the United Kingdom and was able to review analytical results. And they allegedly then examined some samples provided by the UK government. But this was the key thing. The toxic chemical compound which displays the toxic properties of a nerve agent is the same toxic chemical that was found in the biomedical and environmental samples relating to the poisoning of the Skripals. But then it goes on to say the name and structure of the identified toxic chemical are contained in the full classified report of the Secretariat, which was available to states parties, but it wasn't available to the media. So the BBC claim that it absolutely definitively was Novichok was never stated publicly by the OPCW. So that came via some government briefing.
So you're saying they haven't named, the OPCW didn't name Novichok specifically?
Not specific.
They said
correct.
it's the same agent.
That's correct.
And by the way, the Charlie Rowley, Dawn Sturgis story was that Charlie Rowley, months after the alleged Novichok attack, he was meandering down the country lane, found a shrink-wrapped bottle of perfume from the pound shop on the side of the road or something, or in a bin, and decided, oh, I'm going to bring it home to my girlfriend or partner. And she opened it, sprayed, and then all of a sudden, died of Novichok.
Right.
I mean, it's the most ridiculous story narrative that you can imagine, and somehow that passed as sort of plausible by the mainstream press. Nobody questioned it at all. Nobody.
Well, keep that thought in mind. So look, here's what Jeremy Hunt said. The recklessness of the Russian state in bringing a nerve agent to the UK was never proved, and total disregard for the safety of the public is appalling and irresponsible. But you're talking about what passed the muster of the mainstream press. Let's not forget that the chief medical officer for England made this statement that if you get Novichok on your clothes or your personal property, wash your clothes and wipe down any personal items, shoes and bags with a cleansing or baby wipes before disposing of them in the usual way. This was the chief medical officer at the time, the equivalent of Chris Whitty, saying this, talking about a weapons grade nerve agent is what we were being told at the time. And she was saying baby wipes will sort it out.
Yeah, they said it was the most dangerous nerve agent known to man, 5 times more lethal than VX, right?
Right.
And it didn't kill the Skripals, apparently. It's more like the symptoms they had were fentanyl poisoning, if you really want to dig down deep into it.
Could well have been. So why is the government mentioning this at this time, aside from the Russian propaganda situation? Well, they've launched an inquiry now into Dawn Sturgis, and they've now appointed the chairman of that, and that inquiry into the Dawn Sturgis death will begin on the 17th of March. So we are going to see from the 17th of March on major mainstream media coverage of an inquiry into this. And are they going to ask about baby wipes? I don't think so. But let's move on, because this was the next thing they said. They had to bring Navalny back in again, Patrick. So we're absolutely being bombarded, but this is setting up this narrative that Russia is associated in some way with chemical and biological weapons, ready for the blame game in a few days' time, should there be some kind of event in Ukraine.
Oh, the Navalny poisoning plot is even more tenuous than the other ones. It's just incredible. So that's amazing they threw that one in there.
Yes. So right, let's just move on to regime change because clearly there's also a regime change narrative building up in the press at the moment. And Sky News pulled a blinder because they decided to roll out Mr. Russiagate himself, Christopher Steele. Let's have a brief listen to what he has to say.
I think Putin can't be resurrected, as it were, in the international community. I don't see him surviving this in the long term. I think we've gone over a watershed here. And my view is, however, that in the short term, we're going to see probably increased brutality from Russian forces and atrocities in Ukraine, sadly. But in the longer term, the economy and the sanctions and his isolation, both cultural and economic in the world, will tell and will lead to a change of regime in Russia.
Is that the same Christopher Steele that made up that fictional document?
Yeah, the one that was attempting regime change in the United States.
Trump doing water sports in a Russian hotel or something.
Yes.
And it was fake. Yeah,
Yes.
Is that the same guy?
That's the same guy.
The same guy.
Right, let's bring on another guy because here's Chatham House devising the strategy to deter Russia and weaken Putin. This is also calling for regime change. And who has written this? Jamie Shea. Who's Jamie Shea? Former NATO. He's currently at the Royal Institute for International Affairs, but he's a retired member of NATO. He was Deputy Assistant Secretary General for emerging security challenges at NATO headquarters in Brussels until 2018. But he was also the spokesperson for NATO during the Kosovo War. And he famously said this. He said that the NATO killing of civilian adults and children in Kosovo is the cost to defeat an evil. That was his position about what NATO did in Kosovo. Now, Patrick, Vanessa, please explain to me how he can take that position at the same time that NATO and the West are criticizing Russia for what is going on in the Ukraine.
Well, I'll say this and pass it to Vanessa for a comment. But I mean, if that kind of a statement, Mike, says that within the establishment, there is a belief that there are certain things that are permissible in what they consider warfare. All is fair in war. And so is that killing women and children in order to create a public relations victory and advance policy further or objectives further? Is that permissible? How common is that within the hierarchy of the deep state or the government? That's a good question. I'd like to know.
Vanessa.
Again, what can I say? You know, when the US and coalition, so the US and UK predominantly, obliterated Raqqa and Mosul, hitting predominantly residential areas to flush out ISIS that they fund and arm and equip anyway. So that was effectively an ethnic cleansing program. You know, the fact is, how can we believe anything that these entities are saying? I just want to point out one thing. In 2020, the UNGA passed a resolution combating the glorification of Nazism, neo-Nazism, and other practices that contribute to fueling contemporary forms of racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia, and related intolerance. Who were the two countries that refused to sign? The United States and Ukraine.
And there's a couple of abstentions, weren't there, Vanessa, as well, right?
Yeah. But I mean, they point blank refused to sign it. So I mean, that kind of says everything, doesn't it?
Yeah, well, it does, especially when we look at how the censorship machine is working on this war as well.
The United Kingdom abstained, Pat. You're right. Just looked.
Yeah, and you were recently you've been suspended, haven't you, from your social media account, Vanessa, for what?
Yeah.
Commenting on this same topic?
Well, I'm pretty certain it came from the BBC, who, of course, have had a vendetta against me for a number of years now.
Yeah.
But I tweeted out the fact that the BBC, in their latest BBC News report, had platformed a trainer of civilians who was wearing the SICH, the Sikh battalion badge on his arm. And the Sikh battalion was created by Svoboda, which of course is the ultra-nationalist Nazi party, in Ukraine. And here's the BBC making them the poster boy of the Ukrainian resistance, just as, of course, they made Al-Qaeda members the poster boys of the Syrian revolution. And bang, as soon as that went out, literally about 10 seconds after my account was permanently suspended.
Okay, nothing changes. Right. Okay.
Right.
Well, let's just very briefly talk about Liz Truss, our lovely Foreign Secretary. Boris Johnson's attack dog at the Atlantic Council is how I've headlined that. Why have I done that? Well, this is really a dig at the Daily Mail because this was their headline this morning. Yesterday, Sergei Lavrov says Russia didn't attack Ukraine and so on. But the first paragraph says Vladimir Putin's attack dog met with Ukraine's. And I just find that really offensive, Patrick, because this is. Whatever you think, this is a foreign minister of a sovereign state, and to use this kind of language is appalling. So I've called.
They're channeling their inner news of the world, aren't they? That's what they're doing.
Certainly, it seems like very Second World War in their propaganda. But anyway, that's why I chose to call Liz Truss that. It's all she deserves. But look, she's speaking to the Atlantic Council yesterday, and this is what she said. It feels like a different world. We thought that energy crises, expansionism, and geopolitical strife were behind us. Now those illusions have been shattered. Russia built its capabilities in plain sight, violating its commitments and acting with impunity in Georgia, in Crimea, and beyond. We knew what Putin was doing. The world has woken up. The era of complacency is over. We must rise to this moment. We must pledge that never again will we allow such aggression to go unchecked. He has shaken the architecture of the global security. The invasion of Ukraine, she said, is a paradigm shift on the scale of 9/11. And how we respond today will set the pattern for the new era. But let me be clear, we're still not doing enough. We must double down and we have to ramp up the global pressure on Putin. We must deepen our partnerships in other areas. She talked about AUKUS, but also security in the Arctic Circle and so on. So that's the position. It's a paradigm shift on the scale of what happened following 9/11, which of course brought us into the whole war on terror, all 20 years of warfare in Afghanistan and the complete annihilation of Iraq.
Well, the point of 9/11 is, I won't belabor this, but that triggered Article 5. It's the only time, I believe, in history that Article 5 of NATO has been invoked, and they claimed that they were attacked somehow by Afghanistan, who doesn't even actually have a standing army. So certainly that couldn't have been the state that attacked the United States, but nonetheless, it flipped the switch, Mike, for NATO to expand into Central Asia. And go for 20 years and accomplish absolutely nothing in the process, other than windfalls of profits for all of the various people feeding at the trough of the military-industrial complex. And don't forget about the heroin trade. Hey, price of heroin dropped on the streets of Europe, record lows. So hey, wasn't a big loss, was it? They achieved something, I guess.
They did. But look, let's move on to the propaganda again. And we've mentioned the situation with the hospital.
Well, this is Mariupol here. This was on the front page of every news. So this was the image of the day yesterday on every single British newspaper and globally as well. You can see you've got 5 men carrying a makeshift gurney there with a pregnant woman on. The allegation here is that Russia bombed a maternity hospital. So this would have been a fighter bomber, according to this narrative. So Russia would have had an air. So there should be videos of, because Russia hasn't been doing many airstrikes around cities. So there should be lots of video footage of this, of the bombing raid, right? Really? I mean,
it's interesting that the pregnant woman on there has been accused by Russia of being a crisis actor.
Yes, yeah. Well, there's a couple of pregnant women that are starring in this particular news story, and we'll take a look at a few of them. One of them is extremely interesting. But so this is a scene. This picture was used on every single Western corporate mainstream media outlet. This was the defining image here of Putin's barbarism, according to all the various headlines here. And so here is one of the video that were done by Channel 4. And of course, we'll ask Vanessa about Channel 4's exploits in Syria. But as you can see, this is a scene here. Lots of people crowded around where this bombing took place. So it's like everyone returned to the bomb site and there's a few cars on fire. It's difficult to say exactly what happened here. This is one of the stars there. You'll see her again. She's on the front, wrapping the bandage feverishly around the head of this woman. Is she wounded? Nobody knows. Babies in incubators, that's an obligatory shot as well for a good news package on brutality of evil dictators, and a bloodstained mattress there. Not much explanation as to who died there or what. No one seems to know much. But these images are the defining images. You can see the crowd there and people walking towards the camera. Very white helmet-esque
Yes.
in terms of just the basic staging. There's the bomb crater. That's interesting. What created that crater? Russia says, Mike, that it wasn't a bombing raid from the Russian Air Force. They say it was something placed there, perhaps a fertilizer bomb or something to that effect. So, but you can see the scene here. So this is a square, and the hospital they're talking about in question is on the edge of the square. So apparently this bomb was, according to the official narrative, was hit the middle of the square. The
So
blast
instead of a precision bomb landed in the middle of the square rather than landing in one of the buildings themselves.
Exactly, Mike. Mike, you just destroyed their narrative with one simple question. So here's the star of this, and she's an Instagram influencer. She does a lot of makeup work. She's in Mariupol here, and so she's become quite famous now because of this. But there she is, wounded apparently, making her own way down this blown out staircase there with full of bags, carrying lots of stuff. So clearly she doesn't look that stressed. And these guys are just kind of looking on over her shoulder there. It's a bit strange, the whole thing.
Yeah.
You know, people say, "Oh, is there staging here?" She does look at the camera in that kind of alluring, seductive way. What is this? Is this for the press? Is this real war footage? I don't know what we're looking at here. We'll go, Vanessa. How about the Channel 4 footage? You looked at that. You've seen Channel 4 in action. What are your thoughts?
Well, I mean, this is so reminiscent, as you said, of the white helmet enactments, right? I mean, I think, Mike, you just mentioned the fact that there's a crater in the ground, and yet the building behind it is intact. The other thing that the Russian foreign ministry put out, in fact, Lavrov, was the fact that actually the hospital was pretty derelict. It had not been used as a maternity hospital for years, and actually it had been taken over by the Azov neo-Nazi brigades and was being used as a military center. Now, where have we heard that before?
Yeah.
You know, and Channel 4 in particular, as you mentioned them, and I've been watching a number of their reports from supposedly inside Ukraine. Why do I say supposedly? Because you tend to have people like Lindsay Hilsum, the Channel 4 presenters, against a backdrop telling you what's going on, and then cutting to, for example, I saw one Lindsay Hilsum report where she's talking about the threatening behavior of the Russian Navy in the Black Sea, and they cut to Twitter footage. I mean, it clearly states at the bottom that this is from Twitter. So we have absolutely no verification of when this footage was taken, whether it was taken during a previous naval exercise, for example. Another report shows them simply showing you footage of dead bodies inside cars. Now, we've been hearing stories, particularly in Mariupol, of the Ukrainian National Guard shooting people trying to leave via the Russian established humanitarian corridors. They don't even they don't even proffer this as a potential explanation. It is quite simply the Russians have shot these drivers in their cars and left the bodies on the street, right? So you're not even given any potential that there might be another context to the story they're presenting you with. And again, that is mirror image of what they did in Syria, particularly in East Aleppo. Pat, I think you'll remember in December 2016, the report by Parrick O'Brien that I challenged him on, and he actually exchanged with me, where I picked him up on the claim that a premature baby unit had been targeted underground in Aleppo. And the video footage actually came from Al Jazeera, not from Channel 4. And this is, of course, almost always the MO of Channel 4, BBC, etc. They'll be using stringers on the ground that will be providing them with the footage that they then use to produce the narratives that they need to produce to protect state policy, basically.
Yes, I'm sorry, Vanessa, those stringers on the ground, of course, probably in many cases trained by BBC Media Action and Thomson Reuters Foundation. and part of the whole white helmets infrastructure.
Absolutely. And just going back to this particular footage of the premature baby unit, there was one section of the Channel 4 report that I seriously confronted Parrick O'Brien on. And I said, you can't possibly tell me that what they're taking out of that incubator is a live baby or even a human baby. To me, it looks like a doll. They're carrying it around like a rugby ball. He argued the fact, but then later I noticed that in the Channel 4 report, that section had been edited out, but the entire report maintained its credibility, according to Channel 4. So this is what I'm saying to people. Be aware that this is what they do. They will use for...
We got it frozen.
Yes, we're frozen there for a second.
We'll try to
ground.
reconnect.
All of them, yeah, all of them are using the same footage, the same photographs. Who are they supplied by? If that area is effectively occupied by the Azov battalions or by the fascist brigades, who's supplying them with that information? That's what people need to be asking themselves, because these guys aren't on the ground. Most of them left after Putin threatened them with the Gulag if they produce fake news against Russia. So the majority of them left Kiev, left Ukraine, right?
I might add, too, that I believe the Russian ambassador to the United Nations reported to the UN that that particular area in Mariupol, that particular hospital had been commandeered by the Azov battalions. So that was days before this supposed Russian bombing there. So what could have happened, a series of events could have transpired. Who knows what the truth is? We can't say for sure. But certainly it doesn't make any sense that Russia would warn the UN and then go and then sort of, drop a Moab on the square. It doesn't make any sense. So, well, we'll listen to what the Russian DOD said. Here's the official statement from the Russian Department of Defense here. We'll go ahead and roll this video statement.
But Moscow points out it's a base for the neo-Nazi Azov battalion, who kicked out babies and everyone else a long time ago.
Absolutely no ground target operations were carried out by Russian aviation in the region of Mariupol. The alleged airstrike is a completely staged provocation to maintain anti-Russian agitation among the Western audience. We have repeatedly stated that medical institutions in Mariupol stopped their regular work at the end of February. All staff and patients were dispersed by the nationalists. The hospital building, due to its advantageous tactical location close to the city center, has been converted into a stronghold of the Azov National Battalion. Photos of the hospital ground contain evidence of two separate staged explosions near the hospital. The nature of the external and internal damage to the building may mislead the mass non-professional audience in Europe and the USA for which this production was made, but not experts. I would like to emphasize that all these and other war crimes in Mariupol are committed by the raiders locked up in the city. We have repeatedly warned that as the ring around them shrinks, the number of Nazi provocations will increase. They have nowhere to run from there.
So, we've seen plenty of footage, Mike, of these battalions having their artillery in residential areas, launching mortars from rooftops. We've seen this in Donetsk and Lugansk as well. We've seen this in Idlib with the terrorists there. With al-Nusra and all the rest of them. So, and also there's plenty of footage that circulated early of people trying to get out of Mariupol, and in some cases were actually shot by people trying to keep people from escaping. They weren't allowing the residents to escape. Why would they do that? Why would you want to keep the residents in the city? Why would you not want the civilians to evacuate?
Human shields, the propaganda opportunity. I mean, there are many reasons.
Yeah, and this has been reported for weeks, Mike, for weeks. Since the beginning of this conflict, those reports have been coming out. So for the West to stand there and say, oh, that's not happening, it's the Russians, is totally disingenuous. But yeah.
Yeah, which brings us on to Boris.
Boris Johnson. So the chemical weapons talking point here. There you go, ladies and gentlemen, that's the Telegraph yesterday. There's the famous hospital shot. Look at the headline, though, Mike. It's not really about the hospital, is it? Russia plotting chemical attack. So the talking point has been unleashed. and the Prime Minister decided to weigh on this as well in his objective fashion. Let's listen to what Boris Johnson has to say.
I'll make you one other prediction, by the way, which is that the stuff that you're hearing about chemical weapons, this is straight out of their playbook. They start saying that there are chemical weapons that have been stored by their opponents or by the Americans, and so when they themselves deploy chemical weapons, as I fear they may, they have a sort of a Maskirovka, a fake story ready to go. And you've seen it in Syria. You saw it even in the UK when.
This is what you expect next, then.
Look, I just note that is what they're already doing. It is a cynical, barbaric government, I'm afraid.
Well, Boris said it, Mike. Why should we question any of that?
Well, it must be true then, because everything that comes out of Boris's mouth is true.
Incredible amount of spin and propaganda there. I really don't know where to start.
Okay, well, let's move on. If you like what the UK Column does and you would like to support us, then please head over to community.ukcolumn.org, and there are options to help us out there. Also, share our material if you could on the various platforms that we're still on. And if you would like to support us through the shop, that would be fantastic as well. But right, now let's move on to this. Another update on Ukraine was pushed out yesterday, sorry. For every Ukrainian passport holder, they will now produce a streamlined process. Lots of people saying this is not good enough because, of course, many people have run away from Ukraine because the bombs are raining from the skies. Many people have run from Ukraine, so they've left their passports behind, if they even had a passport at all. But anyway, the UK is saying they're going to streamline the process, going to make it easier. And on Monday, they're going to launch a campaign to encourage, a bit like Clap for the NHS or something, but they're going to launch a campaign to encourage every householder in the UK to, sponsor a Ukrainian into the country and put them up for a while. How could that possibly go wrong, Patrick?
Oh, I can't see any potential problems there, Mike, especially with the foster home system. No problems there, right? Nothing to see there.
Nothing to see.
Yes.
Now, look, let's just put this on. Just very briefly, want to talk about this. This is an article in the BBC. Ukraine war images reveal scale of destruction in Mariupol. And of course, if you look at that headline, you're expecting to see flattened buildings and scenes similar to what we saw in Aleppo, for example. But actually, what are the pictures that they are providing? Well, we've got
the notorious
hospital there.
Blast.
There's the notorious
bomb crater.
Indeed.
The Russian bomb here.
And so on. So, but look, I just wanted to compare that bomb crater, Patrick, with this bomb crater here. Well, in fact, this isn't a bomb crater. It's just a crater which was caused by an explosion in Texas at a fertilizer plant. And my point here is that it is impossible to tell from a hole in the ground what caused the hole in the ground. So this is a very similar looking hole in the ground caused by a fertilizer plant explosion. And as you were making, so just reinforce the point you were making earlier on, that it's impossible to tell what created that hole.
Especially when there's no shrapnel from any bombs or missiles in the actual crater in question. It does lead one to question, but there might be an alternative hypothesis.
Indeed.
Is that allowed to have an alternative hypothesis?
No, it certainly is not. As Vanessa has discovered, you immediately get kicked off every platform going.
So the narrative trumps any alternative hypothesis.
It does,
right?
yes.
I see.
And a couple of other pictures here. We get to see what Mariupol looked like before and what it looks like now. Now, of course, the trees have no leaves on them because it's winter. But the buildings there is damage, of course, but they're still standing and so on. So let's just zoom in on that. And, my point is, where is the evidence of this wide-ranging war criminal activity that's alleged of Russia? I don't see it still.
No, there's plenty of evidence of shelling, of fighting, but you're not going to get a straight story from our media on this. They've already proven that they're absolutely skewed to one side, almost in a religious fashion. They literally won't even go to any alternative explanations or any point of view other than what they have established, which is very, very rigid, which is that Putin's on a blitzkrieg He woke up one day and decided to reinstitute the Soviet Union, and he wants to take over Eastern Europe. Liz Truss herself said this in an
Yes.
interview on Sky, that he wants to take over large swaths of Eastern Europe. I don't think he's ever stated that he ever was going to do that. Russia's been very specific. What we're saying is, we're far be it from us to take any sides in a war, but our point is, if you look at the facts and what preceded the conflict, it didn't surprise us what happened. We were surprised at the speed in which it happened and the depth, but we saw this coming because Russia had been warning about this for a decade. And so it was really just a question of time. They drew red lines, but everybody's standing back with their hands up saying, oh, I can't believe what Russia's done here. I can't believe what Putin's doing. It's just he's trying to destroy democracy and destroy our way of life in the West. That's the narrative. Anything that deviates from that, not entertained.
Now, speaking of narratives, what's Facebook coming up to?
Well, this is the Nazi glorification issue. Okay, so Facebook has announced they're lifting their moratorium of Nazi glorification, right? So you can accuse or you can call for the death of Russian troops.
We'll come on to that in a second, but
Yeah,
yes.
so that's basically it. So that would have been a good setup for this, but we'll get to that in a second. But so this is Mark Zuckerberg in a speech not so long ago in October of 2019. And we're talking about war censorship here. There's a war on. This is a world war now. This is a proxy war. It's West, NATO versus Russia. Ukraine is the proxy pitch, okay? That's clearly what's happening because the Western media is completely invested in this, as is the financial system. This is a world war. It just hasn't become a full shooting world war yet, but it is economically and in terms of information warfare. There's no argument about that. So here's Mark Zuckerberg talking about information and war. Listen to this 2-3 years ago. Go ahead.
Back when I was in college, our country had just gone to war in Iraq. And the mood on our campus was disbelief. A lot of people felt like we were acting without hearing a lot of important perspectives. And the toll on soldiers and their families and our national psyche was severe, yet most of us felt like we were powerless to do anything about it. And I remember feeling that if more people had a voice to share their experiences, then maybe it could have gone differently. And those early years shaped my belief that giving more people a voice gives power to the powerless and pushes society to get better over time.
Well, he seems to have done a complete U-turn then.
Yeah, so I guess he didn't really didn't go very deep in his psyche, did it? So let's just look at Mr. Zuckerberg and Facebook, or we'll call it Meta now, right? It's the metaverse. So effectively, this is what's been happening over the last month with Facebook and Meta. This is Mark Zuckerberg, and that is, whoa, that's the Azov Battalion badge there. That's their insignia. You can see the black sun rising in the background and that sort of quasi-swastika symbol. Take that very seriously because that's the Azov battalions. This is the Ukrainian armed forces. They're in every single regiment of Ukraine's military now, thanks to the recent reforms by President Zelensky. And this effectively equals, and I'm going to make this argument because this argument's been made by a number of people. These aren't neo-Nazis. These are actual Nazis. These are people that glorify the Waffen-SS, that stand under Stefan Bandera and the Nazi march towards Stalingrad. Okay, so effectively, Azov battalions is the equivalent. It's the modern day equivalent of the Nazi and the Waffen-SS. So it's not neo-Nazi. These are actual Nazis. They're paramilitaries. They're armed. They're ideologically driven. They glorify the Holocaust and so forth. Okay, so that's who Mark Zuckerberg is basically running cover for. So our question is this an endorsement by Mark Zuckerberg of Nazism? Is this an endorsement of Meta, of Nazi values, of Nazi history, of the reemergence of militant Nazism in Europe? Is this an endorsement of that by Facebook and Meta and all the employees at Facebook and the CTO and the CFO and the board and the shareholders. Is that what this is? That's a fair question to ask.
Yes.
Because they are suspending people left, right, and center for warning people about the Azov battalions by posting insignias and trying to educate people. I know plenty of people personally that have already been suspended for doing just that by Facebook. What is going on here?
So that brings us on to Zelensky.
Well, speaking of Zelensky, we just found this old choice clip from the archive. I think this is circa 2016, where El Presidente, Vladimir Zelensky, when he was an actor, when he was doing stage prop, he basically spells it right out here, what a Nazi cauldron his country has been all these years, especially post-Maidan with the US-backed violent coup that overthrew the democratically elected president in 2014. Listen to Zelensky here.
Для нас, европейцев, это нормально. Сегодня наш президент, ну, самый главный, который у нас самый главный президент, Барак Обама, пообещал, что мы скоро вступим в НАТО. Пока, естественно, на правах американского прихвостня. Если есть возможность, друзья, вышлите, пожалуйста, мне книгу Гитлера «Майн кампф». А то у нас разметают. Бывало, утром выхожу на балкон и начинаю делать зарядку. От сердца к солнцу, вот так. Ну, что я вам рассказываю, вы же так...
Okay, so he's doing a stand-up routine, but of course, that type of routine is taking the mickey out of reality.
It is. He's basically saying that the country is overrun with actual Nazis. Mein Kampf is sold out, and everyone does their morning salute, does the Roman salute when they wake up in the morning. So he's kind of doing in a bourgeois, tongue-in-cheek fashion. But what he's really saying is the reality there, and the reality is, well, that man, that comedian who played the president, ended up becoming president just a couple of years later, and now he is being propped up by actual Nazi battalions. That's the only thing keeping him in power. And this is why he's stalling for time. This is why he won't agree to any real meaningful ceasefire. And they're trying to drag it on to get the foreign fighters in, to get the weapons in, to create a quagmire. That's UK policy, that's US policy, that is NATO central planning. They do not want this war to end any time soon. I guarantee you this. Listen to their words, watch their actions, and it tells you all you need to know.
So
looking at the media coverage here, look at this.
Oh.
Okay, this is the media coverage. If we go to this slide here. So how Western media covered Zelensky before the war started. Look at this. Just some clippings here, Mike. This is before the war. Look at all this. Far-right problems. Zelensky deepens alliance with the far right. The IMF ranks Ukraine as Europe's poorest country. Hate crimes against LGBT people in Ukraine. Ukraine's Nazi problem and dead journalists in Ukraine. This is Zelensky's Ukraine. The media seemed to be concerned about this before January, Mike, but something happened. They all did a volte-face now. Now he's Churchill. He's the sort of the reincarnation of Winston Churchill now. How did this happen? Like, so they're just ignoring that this is a reality. We keep hearing this. There's no Nazis in Ukraine. You keep hearing this talking point.
What can we say? Right, let's move on to this then. This is tweeted out yesterday by the Russian embassy in the USA. Here it is. We demand that US authorities stop the extremist activities of Meta, take measures to bring the perpetrators to justice. Users of Facebook and Instagram did not give the owners of these platforms the right to determine the criteria of truth and pit nations against each other. So what was Russia getting upset about? Well, it was this Reuters exclusive. Facebook and Instagram to temporarily allow calls for violence against Russians. That's how Reuters covered it, and they put this out as well on Twitter. As a result of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, we have temporarily made allowances, this is a spokesperson for Meta, for forms of political expression that would normally violate our rules, like violent speech such as death to the Russian invaders. We still won't allow credible calls for violence against Russian civilians. So Reuters was claiming they'd seen internal memos distributed by email. And so this is what Meta is alleged to have said inside these emails. We're issuing a spirit of the policy alliance to allow T1 violent speech that would otherwise be removed under the hate speech policy when A, targeting Russian soldiers except prisoners of war, or B, targeting Russians where it's clear that the context is the Russian invasion of Ukraine, e.g. content mentions the invasion, self-defense, etc. We're doing this because we've observed that in this specific context, Russian soldiers is being used as a proxy for the Russian military. The hate speech policy continues to prohibit attacks on Russians. So that's what they said, Patrick, and that's their position now.
It's a slippery slope, isn't it? Because then they start defining who's a combatant, who's a non-combatant. The West are already saying that the Russian people are responsible for this war. That's why they're trying to destroy their economy through sanctions and embargoes. So you can't have it both ways, unfortunately. Facebook, Meta is taking a side in a war, a major war. They're trying to advance the war itself. They're not making statements calling for peace or a ceasefire or anything like that with all of their power, with all of their billions. None of that. They're saying, go ahead and call for the assassination of the Russian president. Go ahead and call for violence against Russian troops. And who knows? How do you define who's a combatant and a non-combatant?
Right, exactly. And Vanessa, we're staring down the barrels of new legislation, which is going to censor a lot of people. And the justification that the British government made beginning in 2017 for the production of this legislation was to get violent extremist terrorist content off platforms like Facebook and Twitter and so on. But the truth is that has never happened. And when we look at Syria as an example, there was never a particular restriction on the posts from the more extreme arms of the so-called Syrian opposition.
Well, yeah, and the fact that the BBC is clearly platforming neo-Nazi battalion members in their BBC News without any reference to that, it's extraordinary. And I'd just like to mention about the fact that Britain that has, according to leaked documentation, has been training the far-right battalions in the Ukraine, is now fast-tracking passports for Ukrainians leaving the country. Now, I don't know if 2013, Ukrainian Pavlo Lapshin murdered 82-year-old Mohammed Salim in Birmingham and then placed bombs outside a further 3 mosques. He belonged to the Wotan Jugend group, which hold events at Azov facilities, and is led by Azov member Alexei Levkin. And Azov member actually took part in the Christchurch massacre in Australia also. So one has to ask, without being accused of being far right, what's going to happen to the far right elements that are going to be escaping from Ukraine and are now being fast-tracked into the UK?
Very good question. Yes. And I can extend what Vanessa has said there. What happens if the Ukraine is made a member of the EU and stands within the Schengen visa zone? You then have the actual hotbed of real militant Nazism, violent, ideological-driven Nazism in the Schengen zone. This is what all the European parliamentarians are calling for. This is what the Ukrainians, this is what Zelensky is demanding, along with World War III. He wants to be a member of the EU as well. How dangerous is that? It's probably just as dangerous, Vanessa, as making Turkey a member of the European Union based on the sort of traffic of jihadism that we've seen all the way from Uyghurstan as far as Indonesia, all trafficking through Turkey, right? And what did Turkey do? They kind of used some of these things to blackmail the EU to get money to what? Handle refugees? Could this same thing happen again in Ukraine?
Absolutely. It's very high risk. And, imagine if they were to become, as Turkey is, of course, a NATO member state also. So then you're bringing the two branches of violent extremism into NATO.
I'll just make the point we mentioned on the program a couple of days ago that Polish contacts of mine telling me that the Polish population extremely concerned about the numbers of Ukrainians coming into Poland at the moment. The figure that I've seen in the Western media is around 150,000, but Polish media are suggesting it could be as much as 1 million. I'm taking that figure with a very large grain of salt, but I would imagine the truth is somewhere in between those two numbers. But nonetheless, once they're into Poland, they're into the Schengen zone, and that's it.
That's right. And also, I might add that President Zelensky voiced his condemnation of Russian humanitarian corridors that led into Russia or Belarus. That he forbids, effectively, he's forbidding his people from going to Belarus or Russia to flee the war that he himself is demanding to fight to the last man, the last bullet, practically. So that's an extraordinary thing in itself.
Okay, let's look at the economic impact then, Patrick.
Well, just quickly, we talk about the Great Reset, Mike. It looks like Russia is doing its own reset now as a result of sanctions here. Look at this, Visa and MasterCard basically shutting it down. There's columns of Russian truckers in Europe that can't access money for fuel because their Visa and their MasterCards are no longer working. Well done, sanctions. But look at this, SureBank. This is one of Russia's biggest lenders here. There's two systems here, the Mir system and China's UnionPay. So they're probably going to be issuing cards now. Okay, so you're going to have basically, if this advances, Mike, the way it looks like it's going to advance, you're going to have potentially one of the biggest economic blocks in the world now with a competitor to Visa and MasterCard. Now, this is going to take years to get on, and here we go. The move could allow Russia to make some payments overseas. UnionPay operates in 180 countries and regions. Visa and MasterCard said any transactions initiated with their cards issued in Russia will no longer work outside the country from March the 10th. And finally, SureBank is looking for the possibility of issuing cards for these people, and this is all basically suspended as a result of the Ukrainian situation. Now, censorship. We talked about big tech censorship, and we'd like to think that there's some ethical companies out there that aren't as bad as Google, right? That there's some alternatives, right?
Right.
That we could go. If we get kicked off Twitter, we can go to Getter, or we can go to
MeWe or Gab.
MeWe or Gab, and they're not going to get involved in the wartime censorship, are they? So Google, what's the biggest alternative to Google? Where do you go for your searches?
Well, DuckDuckGo, of course.
DuckDuckGo, yeah, I like DuckDuckGo. I get behind DuckDuckGo, but sadly, DuckDuckGo has shown itself. Well, they've shown their true colors here. This is Gabriel Weinberg here. I guess he's the big boss at DuckDuckGo. Like so many others, I am sickened by Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the gigantic humanitarian crisis it continues to create. Hashtag stand with Ukraine. We at DuckDuckGo have been rolling out search updates to downrank any sites associated with Russian disinformation.
Right.
So they're doing exactly what Google has been doing to everybody, including ourselves, for the last so many years, okay? And he follows up here, this is even better. In addition to downranking sites that we don't like or we think are associated with Russian disinformation or just disinformation, we also often place news modules and information boxes at the top of DuckDuckGo's search results where they are seen and clicked the most to highlight quality information like Wikipedia and the WHO.
Trusted sources.
Trusted sources, the BBC, for instance. So they're now in this game. I mean, is that the stupidest thing ever? That was their one unique selling point. As a second-tier search engine, they've just given up their market advantage over Google. I think that's really just the death knell for DuckDuckGo. So, get on Twitter and tell us what you think about tag DuckDuckGo and get into that conversation. Let's have that lively debate with Gabriel Weinberg at DuckDuckGo. Let them know what you think.
Yeah, indeed. Okay, well, look, we got to leave it there. Vanessa, have you got any closing thoughts? What do you think? What do you think's next?
Is next, I think there's a very high likelihood of a false flag of some description. We have to wait and see if NATO member states. I mean, the thing is, when you watch Joe Biden, who consistently makes the most appalling blunders in his speeches, and then as you showed, Pelosi, Kamala Harris. I mean, the West is pretty psychotic at the moment, and so where one thinks there might be a degree of reticence to actually head or precipitate a third world war, I'm beginning to wonder if they really are not going to do that.
Yeah.
Yeah, and she's not alone. She's not alone. A lot of people are worried. They're worried because they're losing confidence in the political leadership and in the media. These people who are supposed to sort of, be refereeing and moderating all these important discussions in diplomacy are all failing miserably, and instead they're balkanizing the world's population
Yes.
along their own ideological lines, and it's very dangerous. And like I said before, these are the exact same conditions that preceded previous world wars, particularly the Second World War, where Japan was absolutely shut out and isolated and punished. And look what happened in December 7th, 1941. So, but again, some people profited very handsomely from that war. So those who aren't directly involved in it are usually the ones who are the first to push it.
Yes. Okay. Well, look, we've got to leave it there for today. Thank you very much to Vanessa Beeley, to you, Patrick. We will be back on Monday as usual. Hope you have a great weekend, and we'll see you then. Bye-bye.